Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the networking lunch, and we are ready to start this session. And I just want to say welcome to Omega RHO International Honor Society for Operations Research and Management Science, the Honor Society of Informs. It is my pleasure, and I've already had the pleasure of meeting you yesterday and interviewing. We had a great time with that. It's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Laura Albert, PhD. She's the professor and the David Gustafson Department Chair of Industrial and Systems Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research interests are in the field of operations research with a particular focus on discrete optimization with application to homeland security and emergency response problems. Dr. Albert's research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of the Army, and the Sandia National Laboratory. She has authored or co-authored more than 70 publications in archival journals and refereed proceedings. She has been awarded many honors for her research, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellow Award, Institute of Industrial and Systems Engineers Fellow Award, the Informs Impact Prize, 4 publication awards, a National Science Foundation Career Award, a Fulbright Award, and a Department of the Army Young Investigator Award. Dr. Albert has served on the Inform board as the Vice President for Marketing, Communication, Outreach. And this thing is what I think is really cool. She has authored of the blog Punk Rock Operations Research, and you can find her Twitter at Laura Albert, PhD. So it's with my pleasure to welcome Dr. Albert to the stage.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome. I'm honored and humbled to be here today to give the Omega Rho lecture, and I'm excited that there are so many people here in person, as well as some others joining us virtually. I'm especially excited because I've really enjoyed coming to the Omega Rho lecture over the years. And sometimes when I have to miss a class that I'm teaching because I'm coming to Informs, I give my students the assignment of watching one of those pre-recorded Omega Rho lectures. So I'm in good company and, again, very humbled and honored to be here. So you've seen the relevance of OR the past couple of years in particular. OR has the ability to address some of our greatest challenges. And we've got the right tools, but we have a lot of work to do. There's some big problems out there. So you may be here to learn a little bit more about public sector operations research and how it can address public sector challenges and influence policy. And if that's the case, then you're in the right place. In my talk today, I'll talk through some stories on my academic and professional career. And by the end, you'll have some understanding of some avenues for having impact with our academic research. But I won't have all the answers in terms of solving our society's greatest challenges. You'll have to help me with that. I'm going to get started by asking a question. And why is it that OR and analytics have been so useful in addressing some of our world's biggest challenges? We've seen that it's true. We've seen that OR makes a difference. But what's so special about OR? What do we have to offer? Before I answer that, I'm going to jump into a super abridged version of operations research history. And I'll revisit this question at the end of my talk. Our field is pretty young, less than 100 years, but it's a model-centric discipline, and it has mathematical origins that go way back to mathematicians such as Newton, Bernoulli, Euler, Gauss, Lagrange. Our field really emerged during World War II, especially in Britain, during the war efforts when probability models were used to, for example, come up with randomized submarine surveillance strategies. And it was really useful, and OR took off. And so did optimization. The simplex algorithm was invented. There were large-scale optimization methods, and OR was really useful for solving a lot of transportation problems. And many in our discipline pointed operations research to the so-called wicked problems, some of our greatest challenges that our world faced. This was really healthy for Our discipline, the coin wicked problems, was coined in the early 70s, so about 50 years ago. And a lot of the advances were in public sector operations research. And what I really admire about our discipline is that we don't shy away from the hard problems, whether they be in theory or computation or application. We're ready for the challenge. So our discipline emerged. It had degree programs, we had our first graduates, we had our first journals. And after a generation or so after OR's birth, there was a rigorous discourse on the future of OR. We're still having it today. I wasn't alive at the time, so I've just read about it, and I was really surprised to discover a paper in 1978, written before I was born, that put OR on life support. And the authors in this paper outlined several weaknesses of OR, the interface of theory and application. And unfortunately, I have some bad news, because the next year, operations research was declared dead. And in this paper by OR luminary Russell Ackoff. And this is really interesting, because I joined the field more than 20 years later and thought we had a really vibrant OR community that I joined. And I'm not picking on these authors. These papers, as well as several others that were written at the time, are really fascinating. And I appreciate this, this vigorous intellectual debate about what OR is, what makes it special, what the future should look like. And the community responded, it must have, because we're all here today. I'm happy to say that OR survived and is flourishing. There are more than 6,000 people attending the conference this year, which is outstanding. 2 years ago, before the pandemic, the annual meeting had its highest attendance ever, with more than 7,000 attendees. It was a pretty exciting conference. So I've been thinking about why OR has survived and thrived, maybe against all odds, and maybe the critiques in the paper turned out not to be true. The assumptions that they made weren't exactly right. It's possible and likely that our field adapted to breakthroughs in computation and the abundance of data. These were great opportunities for our discipline. And also, a broader cross-section of society started joining the discipline and doing OR. And that fundamentally improved OR and how we do it. And our community really is thriving. I have one more question, and that is, how can we ensure that OR continues to thrive? And I'll give you a few ideas in the talk. You'll have to wait to the end of the talk to hear my full answer, but I'll give you a few clues along the way. The title of my talk is one of the clues. Doing public sector research has been an important part of our discipline, and I argue will continue to be an important part of our discipline. So I want to transition into the main part of my talk, which will have 3 parts. In the first part of my talk, I will talk about some stories from my operations research journey that highlight the impact beyond the discipline. In the second part of the talk, I will share some observations that I've had about taking our OR messages to the world. And in the third and shortest part of my talk, I'll synthesize some of the key takeaways. First, I want to start with my research journey. So I'll be traveling through a lot of the different research that I've done over the years, and I would subdivide the application areas I've studied in 2 main categories. The first is infrastructure protection. So I've studied aviation security policy and also cybersecurity, and recently elections resilience. And much of my research focuses on public safety. So this includes fire and emergency medical services, and recently policing. I'm going to start with the public safety research. To understand a lot of the research insights, it helps to understand what happens when they respond to a call. In emergency medical services, generally what happens is there's an emergency and a call is placed. When the call is placed, a call center handles the call. They maybe do some triage and decide the appropriate vehicles to respond to the call. And then the service provider responds to the call. They arrive at the scene, provide care to the patient. The vehicle leaves the scene and maybe arrives at the hospital if the patient needs to be transported to the hospital, and they transfer the patient. So what's interesting is that EMS agencies throughout the world have one of their main goals as having faster response times. So typically this is a response time goal of under 9 minutes. And they have other goals as well. But this is the difference between the time when a vehicle is dispatched and when it arrives at the scene. The challenge, of course, one of the challenges is that the patient might view the response time differently. And if we're actually interested in saving lives and making a difference to patient health, this becomes relevant. In terms of decisions, when we make decisions in EMS systems, we make the decisions up front, and we send an ambulance. They usually provide care and non-preemptive service, and they're unavailable sometimes for quite a long period of time. And so this introduces some interdependencies between our decisions. The decisions become interconnected across time, of course, but also across space, because the vehicles and the patients are geographically dispersed on a network. All right, so this is kind of the framework. I've written a lot of papers in this area, and I was trying to summarize what are the key things that I've studied. And I would say that a lot of my research focuses on how to deploy and dispatch these vehicles. And so we're looking at faster response times. There's a question mark there because that's something that I've studied. And my research focuses on how to make these interdependent systems. And really what we're doing is trying to ensure that the right types of vehicles end up in the right places at the right time to care for and treat patients in such a way that we make a difference and enhances patient health, and maybe has fast response times too. But a lot of times what's going on under the hood is optimization, figuring out how to make these interdependent decisions. All right, so one of the goals here is faster response times. I will talk about this response time as a goal. Is this the right way of looking at the problem? Another feature of my research is multiple types of vehicles with different levels of service. So this gets to the patient-centered care approach. And another feature of my research is the use of non-transport vehicles. The big downside, of course, is that they can't take patients to the hospital, which sometimes patients need to go to the hospital. So this introduces a challenge, but also an opportunity. And all of these questions can be interrelated. And so paper by paper, I've pieced through some of these issues and have expanded our knowledge base of how to get ambulances in the right place at the right time to make a difference. I want to talk about this issue of response time. So in here, we have a step function where you get like full credit for if an ambulance responds under 9 minutes and no credit if they respond in 9 minutes or longer. So you get the same amount of credit for responding to a call in 8 minutes and 59 seconds versus like 1 minute. And I was trying to wrap my head around this as an issue when I started working in this area. And it became clear that it was really intuitive for the service providers. It was very unambiguous. They collected a lot of data on response time, so it's easy to measure. And I could see the advantages. But I started talking to service providers and also the medical director. And he was an interesting guy. So he is an emergency medical physician who works in the hospital and doesn't really respond to emergency calls on an ambulance. But he oversaw all the medical decisions. And he was not a fan of the 9-minute response time and proposed a shorter response time of about 5 minutes. And he sent me some papers from the medical literature on this. And the idea here is that for some types of patients, when response times are really important, patient survival decreases. And for cardiac arrest patients, patient survival decreases by about 10% a minute. So when you get to 8 minutes and 59 seconds, it's probably not going to lead to a good patient outcome. So he was proposing this change. The agency was very resistant because the ambulances are spread out on the network. And it was really clear from talking to the EMS leadership that if they changed that response time goal, this would fundamentally alter how they made decisions. And a lot of these responses, the ones between 5 and 9 minutes, would no longer count, and maybe they'd take even longer than 9 minutes to get there. But this was an interesting research question, in part because I needed to convince myself that this 9-minute response time goal was right. So I looked at different response time goals. They always had this step function, but I looked at different response time goals from like 4 or 5 minutes all the way up to 12 minutes. And I optimized each one of these as a goal. And then I looked retrospectively at whether or not cardiac arrest patients would survive. And the results were pretty interesting. And so I examined a bunch of scenarios, and then I superimposed them here on this slide. So the different goals are on the x-axis. These are the different response time goals. And on the y-axis is excess deaths, which we want to minimize. And you can see a pattern that emerged. And what was really surprising is that the best response time goal was 8 minutes, not 5 minutes. And another surprising result was that 9 minutes was pretty good. And I was really surprised by this, and I talked to some other researchers in this area, and all felt that this was the right answer. What was not the right answer was really short response time goals of 4, 5, or 6 minutes. And the intuition here was that the emergency medical physician treats individual patients one at a time. And it's absolutely true that really fast response times matter. But an EMS agency isn't always just treating individual patients. They're treating a system of patients, and they're managing all these interdependent decisions. And actually, a longer response time goal of 8 or 9 minutes gave them more of a chance to reach more patients to save lives. And it did this in a more systematic way. And this was a really non-obvious result that you can only really get to by doing operations research and optimization and taking the interdependencies into account. But this was also promising because I could use the response times as a goal, which I mentioned before was very easy to measure, intuitive, had a lot of support from the service providers. I just had to choose a response time threshold of 8 or 9 minutes instead of 5 minutes. I've given a lot of talks about this type of my research in emergency medical services, and what's also really interesting is some of the feedback that I've gotten from people over the years. And one of the common questions I've had is, isn't it really obvious to know what to do? You don't need optimization, just send the closest ambulance. And quite often you do send the closest ambulance, especially to high priority calls, but there's a lot of things that aren't obvious where optimization adds a lot of value. And this is where I spend a lot of times with service providers trying to help them understand where they can really make a difference and what the opportunities are. So I outlined 5 areas, and there's more if I thought of it, but the first area is ambulance locations. So how to pre-locate ambulances strategically so that you can enable the closest ambulance being there and being available when an emergency arises. I mentioned that they go out and treat patients, and this is non-preemptive service, and sometimes the closest ambulance isn't available. Another area where optimization adds a lot of insight is with backup coverage. What do you do when that closest ambulance isn't available? What's your second choice? It's actually not as obvious what to do in that case. And I have a picture illustrating that in this slide. So this is just a simple example with 4 ambulances and 4 response districts illustrated by a different color. And if a high priority call arrives in the district, you know what to do, send the closest ambulance. If that ambulance is not available and the other 3 are, turns out that 2 of the ambulances are really critical for backup service and the other 2 aren't. You want to ration the other 2 ambulances for other types of service. And this is in part due to geography and also the uneven spread of calls throughout the region. The third area where optimization is helpful is the response to low priority patients. The way to really save a lot of lives is to respond in a timely manner to your low priority patients, but you have to strategically figure out how to respond a little bit longer by sending a different ambulance to some of those low priority calls to enable saving more lives when it really counts. And optimization is really good at figuring out when and how to do that. The fourth area is balanced workloads. Right? So if you use a heuristic or optimization, you will probably have a solution that doesn't spread out the work evenly among your service providers. Some won't be busy enough, and it is helpful for them to practice their skills, and they like to. And some will be too busy, and they can get burnt out. Optimization can exacerbate that and make the workload inequities bigger. The good news is we can attempt to equalize that to a large degree, and it's possible for these types of problems to mostly equalize the workload without sacrificing too much in terms of our overall objective. And I think it's just the humane and right thing to do. And then the last area is vehicle mix, and I want to talk about that because a lot of my early research was on vehicle mix, and some of my recent research is also on vehicle mix. And I'm going to introduce you to the first problem I worked on in this area, and it really had to do with vehicle mix and this very distraught agency. It's often why they come to us. They have a really big problem to solve, and they wanted to maybe change their vehicle mix to see if they could reach more patients in 9 minutes. And they wanted to run some ideas by me, and it led to some interesting research. So there's two main flavors of service provider. The first is what's called the basic life support ambulance, which is staffed by two emergency medical technicians. They can provide pretty basic first aid. They also have advanced life support ambulances, which is also an ambulance, but it has a paramedic on board. And there's quite a step up in the type of service that can be provided by a paramedic versus an EMT. So this is a really big difference. And some patients really need this extra level of care. What the agency wanted to do was actually to replace some of their advanced life support ambulances with an advanced life support non-transport vehicle, which only requires one person. And they had some SUVs that could do this, and they would then fill the SUVs with medical equipment so they couldn't take the patient to the hospital. So what this means is they have to employ multiple response. So they're making this really inefficient decision up front, now sending a BLS ambulance and an ALS non-transport vehicle, which ties up 2 vehicles and 3 individuals, versus the old paradigm that just tied up 1 vehicle with 2 individuals on it. But what this allows them to do is to have this recourse decision where after they provide care at the scene, they can free up the non-transport vehicle if possible. So there are some pros and cons, and this was actually not a really obvious answer to this question, though in retrospect, maybe it should have been obvious. The pros were you can always match the right resource with what the patient needs because you're sending both types of resource, a BLS resource and an ALS resource. You also have more vehicles potentially with this vehicle mix, and you can spread them out, and this can really enable shorter response times. Also, if you send 2 vehicles to a call, it's possible that one can get there really quickly, so you actually can enable much quicker response times potentially. The downside is your vehicles are busier, so they might not be available, and the decisions are not so obvious with regard to dispatch, because now you have a lot more choices, whereas before, you didn't have a choice on which type of vehicle to send. So I wrote a paper in this, and the answer was yes, they should employ non-transport vehicles. And I introduced a new integer programming model that allowed for non-transport vehicles and also triage for the different patient priority levels. And it took a patient-centered care approach, which is still pretty new at the time. And I've also done some follow-up research in this area because there's been a lot to unpack and study. The county actually took this recommendation and ran with it, and they introduced 3 non-transport vehicles. They didn't totally exactly take my optimization model results because the solution was a little political. I'm not good at the politics, I'm just good at the operations research. And they spread out the non-transport vehicles, and it really made a difference. So without any extra resources, they were able to reach 5% more calls within 9 minutes, which is enormous. If you looked at other types of decisions, they can't make that type of impact. So this really made a big difference. And they were kind enough to include me on the team on the National Association of Counties Award. They won an award in analytics, and we won best in category across the entire United States. And we also wrote up the results in Interfaces, which is now the Informs Journal on Applied Analytics. So I mentioned response times, and you'll see them pop up a lot in public safety. They are an important goal. And I mentioned that they're important for saving certain types of lives. They're also important for fire calls because in order to contain a fire, you have to respond quickly. Otherwise, it can spread to other rooms in the building. It's also really important for customer service, even when it's not a matter of life or death. I know this because after talks that I've given on this area, people will tell me how many minutes they waited for an ambulance for a non-emergency call. And so I know you all remember, and it's good, and customer service is an important goal. But response times aren't the entire story. I've only touched on some of my research in this area, but I've been very involved in public safety. And a few years ago, I felt like I was ready for the next challenge. And I usually discover what the next challenge is from interacting with service providers in the field. And I was really amazed at how much the opioid epidemic was affecting their workload. And I have a graph on here from the CDC showing the 3 waves of the opioid epidemic. It started about 20 years ago with prescription opioids. The second wave in orange is the heroin wave. And just in these past few years, we've seen the 3rd wave, which is a really sharp increase there in navy blue of synthetic opioid. And these are overdose deaths due to opioids. Synthetic opioids are really common. They flooded the market, and the most common kind is fentanyl. And it's not getting any better. I hate to say it. Opioid deaths increased 36% in just a single year between 2019 and 2020. So this is, most of it was post-pandemic. And it's just incredibly tragic. And medical doctors have told me that opioid use disorder is a disease of despair and loneliness, and there's a lot of that going on still. So the goal here is really, you can see that the first responders in all these public safety agencies often respond to these types of calls, especially police. They have some additional challenges, because quite often the overdoses typically are not fatal, but they're also associated with crimes. And so they have often, opioid users have many interactions with the police. Not all lead to arrests, but it does lead to a really heavy workload for police officers. And it does lead to arrests. And then various drug users will enter the criminal justice system. Systems are trying to adapt to these challenges, but it's just really expensive for us as a society. Of course, the system is not in steady state. So I was wondering how OR can make a difference. And one of the challenges is, and one of the opportunities is that police are often first responders, and they have an opportunity to actually make a difference, right? It is more work, though. They can't provide treatment, but they can route somebody to treatment. And this requires extra resources beyond the police. They need partner agencies who are really ready to help find the right kind of treatment and to provide resources so that treatment happens and is effective. So the idea is more work in the short term can lead to many benefits downstream. I'm pretty early into this research, but we've had some promising results so far. I've been working with the Madison Police Department, and they have a diversion program that they started before the pandemic and started collecting data. We're really interested in, does it make a difference? And so far we've been studying if it makes a difference in terms of repeat crimes, because this is something that has a large societal cost. We started looking at the data, and the data are really promising, but they're just correlations. Nobody's randomly assigned to treatment. So we wanted to study this in a little bit more detail. I'll tell you how the program works. So it starts with an interaction with a police officer. It's almost always an arrest for a nonviolent crime. If somebody's eligible, they can be referred to treatment. And if they follow up, they'll meet with a counselor. They'll go through a detailed health assessment, and that counselor will help find them an appropriate and individualized treatment plan, and possibly match them with a recovery coach. So there's a lot of resources involved here. Then they have to follow up with the treatment, comply for at least 6 months. And it's worth pointing out that some people are already in treatment and are continuing on. And then if they make it to the end of the 6 months, they might graduate from this program, but they might still be continuing treatment. And what happens is the district attorney just erases their original criminal charge as if it never existed. So it's a big incentive to comply with this program. And the hypothesis is that this, over time, will decrease overdoses and crime and increase community health. Without getting into too many of the details, my co-authors and I have found, using causal inference method, that it suggests that there really is a difference. This program really does cause a difference and a decrease in 6-month recidivism, which is rearrests. So this is really promising. And we're looking at this in more detail to see what this really means over a longer time horizon than 6 months. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about aviation security. And this is really a research topic where the goal from day one was to really influence policy. And to do that, we always have to do good technical OR work. And with my collaborators, I ended up writing a series of papers that introduced the concept of risk-based security to the world. And I started this area actually as a PhD student in September 2001, and working with Sheldon Jacobson, my advisor. And at this time, for decades, there was a very simple security procedures in place that really hadn't undergone major changes, and everybody was treated the same. We just all go through the same security procedure. What a lot of people don't know is that behind the scenes in the 90s, there were some changes to baggage screening, but we as a nation couldn't really see that. It was invisible to us. And so we were proposing something that seemed kind of radical at the time, that different people would be screened in different ways when we go through the airport. But it was clear that our world was not going to be the same, and aviation security wasn't going to be the same. And we have limited resources, and we don't want to wait at the security checkpoint for 6 hours to go through the procedures. So how do we do this in an efficient and also secure manner? And our research really provided new ideas. I mean, the technical work was good. I'm proud of the technical work, but it's the ideas that really ended up making a difference. So we took an approach here for the research, and this was really coming from our connections that were initially in the FAA then, before the TSA existed. And our assumptions that we made were risks are rare, which I think is reasonable for that application area. There are limited resources, and screening procedures makes errors, and these errors might have a cost, and these are false alarms and false clears. I won't go through all the papers, but I'll say one of the insights that we have, or one of the objectives really, is essentially to find a needle in a haystack. These are really rare risks, and we're not going to find a needle in a haystack. So our approach really tries to make a smaller haystack and to focus the resources on that haystack. And we can achieve this by doing less security screening for most of the passengers and parts of the system that are lower risk. And I wrote the papers. I was really hoping somebody would run with them at the TSA, and then nothing happened for a while. So that's the sad part of the story. But thanks to some good luck, somebody from OR joined the TSA and became the architect of the new system that they were going to use for TSA PreCheck, read the papers, and the papers were influential enough in that the ideas and the analysis helped demonstrate that the TSA PreCheck was the future for aviation security over the other alternatives that they were considering. And we actually won an award, the collaborators and the TSA architect, the Informs Impact Prize. So some good luck is, I'll take good luck. But this was really exciting to see the research that I worked on make a difference. 20 years later, there's still a lot of security challenges. And I'll just quickly mention that one of our big challenges today is cybersecurity. And I've been involved in this for a few years. The challenge is huge. I was on a radio program a couple years ago, and we took callers, and one of the callers said, "Oh, there's so many risks out there in cybersecurity. How can we possibly protect all of our cyber infrastructure?" And my response was, yeah, but we have to protect our cyber infrastructure and all the supply chains. It is really enormously challenging, and there's a lot of work to be done. And the problem itself isn't well posed for operations research. We have to do a little bit of work to find where we can make a difference here. But I think there's a couple of features about cybersecurity that I think are interesting. One is that there are a lot of different types of risks. And there's a lot of different adversaries. They have different goals. There's very limited resources. And there's multiple criteria here, not just in terms of costs and risk reduction, but also looking across the life cycle of different components in cyber infrastructure. And for cyber physical systems, we actually want good performance. We want these systems to work. The good news is that the OR tools that we have are very malleable, and we can address a lot of different problems with them. So I hope this becomes an important area for years to come. I'm actually going to be on a cybersecurity panel tomorrow where I'll dig into this some more. I want to move into the second part of my talk, which is the impact beyond the discipline. I've talked a little bit about the research impact that we can see beyond the discipline. But there's a lot more that we can do here. Of course, the center of this, as an academic researcher, is doing good research. We have to expand our knowledge base and address the gaps in the literature. But there's different flavors of impact. Our research can influence best practices. It can influence policy. I've talked about both of those. We can also inform legislation. And we also have an opportunity to tell the public our stories. And this is an exciting area and one that's near and dear to my heart. And for doing all these things, we can actually win awards, in addition to the awards we get for doing research. Some of my research has had impact. I've mentioned the influence on TSA PreCheck. I currently serve on a global cyber consortium that's seeking to develop industrial standards for large, complex projects. My emergency medical service research and fire research, one of my algorithms is used in software to route fire engines. My research has supported the adoption of non-transport vehicles by different agencies, and I currently serve on the Wisconsin EMS board. In my police research, it's pretty new, but it's already helping to expand diversion programs in Wisconsin, and I'm a police commissioner in Middleton, Wisconsin, where I live. These are all opportunities to have some impact beyond the walls of our discipline. I want to, in particular, talk about the media outreach. There are so many ways that we can broadcast our message to the world, and we've seen the last couple years that the public is really interested in what we do and how it relates to their lives. And I want to really highlight this because it's such an opportunity for the future of operations research. We've seen our experts appear in news articles and on news programs in record numbers. Every day, people want to know about supply chains. This is really exciting. I wish we didn't have a crisis driving all of this, but never put a good crisis to waste. I will say what I've learned over the years is that news moves really fast, and we have to move fast with it. Last week, I was on the evening news in Milwaukee. I got an email, and in less than half an hour, we were recording a segment on Zoom. And I actually had to prepare for the interview in that short amount of time. And what I've learned is that we have the small window of opportunity to disseminate our results, but we really have to repackage our insights for public consumption. And I usually prepare by making 2 or 3 takeaways, no more. 2 or 3 key takeaways, and I ask myself what the audience might want to learn from us in operations research. And they're really happy to learn these things, I've come to know. Our media outreach comes in many flavors. I thought of at least 6 flavors. I'm most frequently asked to be an expert for a news article, where I'm also cited with other experts, maybe from different fields. I've mentioned being on various news programs. I've been on the radio in short and long segments. Sometimes I can really delve into some more technical topics on the radio. I've been on podcasts, such as the very excellent Inform's Resoundingly Human podcast. One of my public talks was recorded, and you can watch it on the PBS app. And I've also started writing op-eds, which is probably not a surprise, because like a blogger, as a blogger, I really enjoy telling our stories and being more proactive instead of waiting for the media to come to me and to come to us. And our discipline has a lot to say about policy and what it should look like. And being proactive and getting our messages out there is really important for shaping the conversation and planting some seeds. Public outreach is really important. In some sense, it's like icing on the cake as an academic, but it's more than that. It's really important for the future of operations research, and I thought of a few reasons why. First, it just helps improve the overall scientific literacy in our country. We reach a broader cross-section of society with our messages, which is an opportunity to pull people in. And I mentioned the ability to shape conversations and to plant seeds, especially when it comes to policy changes. It's helpful for many people in the public, and then eventually the legislatures, to read about this and to move the conversations along. We also build trust with the public. This is incredibly important because over my lifetime, I've seen the public support for higher education and scientific research funding erode. And by getting out there, we actually can create more of a positive feedback loop. When people hear about our research and the insights that are relevant to them, that is funded with scientific research dollars that come from their tax dollars, they're more likely to support these investments. And so if we get out there as a community, we can really support the OR infrastructure and the ecosystem so that there's a lot of support for what we do for the next generation. So I know it's a little bit of a call to arms, but it's something that I think is important for us as a community. And I see how much we have to offer the world. And I'd like us to have every opportunity we can to continue making and having an impact. All right, the third and final part of my talk, the key takeaways here. All right, so at the beginning of my talk, I asked a question: how can we ensure that OR continues to thrive? Of course, we have to do really important work and address really important challenges that our society faces, and we're already doing that. Public sector operations research will be important for the future of operations research and can make a difference. Not to say that our advances in computation and theory aren't important. They're all important. But by solving really challenging problems, this often leads to breakthroughs and leads to, in theory and computation, that really help us solve these problems. I want to reiterate the point that the impact that we have, of course we want to have an impact on the discipline. That's crucial. But we can also have a bigger impact that goes beyond the discipline. And this impact isn't always measured in citation counts or H indices. But we can make a difference in the world. And I think it's important that we have research goals that extend beyond the discipline. We have teaching goals that extend beyond the walls of the classroom and the boundaries of the university. You can start a blog, that's one way to do that. But committing to public outreach is one of the ways that we can get there. We can tell our stories and do our part to take care of the discipline by thinking broad and dreaming big. I want to end my talk with some features of operations research that I think can make a real difference. I'm going to state this as 3 lemmas and 1 corollary. So a lemma is a true statement used in proving another true statement, namely that operations research can impact societally relevant problems. The first lemma is that our models offer important insights. I've outlined this in my talk. I've never failed to see people be amazed at some of the insights that we have that we just take for granted, that we think are obvious. They're not obvious. The corollary to this is that even simple models can have deep insights. I've used maximal coverage models in many of the applications I've studied, and it's always the one that has the biggest impact, it seems, even though it's a very simple model. The second insight is that good opportunities are not packaged and labeled for us. We have to discover what they are, and it's work. I've had to figure out where the opportunities are for all the applications I've studied. It usually involves me returning a phone call or an email. Sometimes I just have to carve out a piece of the problem that's really suitable for OR, and that's fun for me. But it's worth the effort. But it's not always the easy part of doing this work. But much like the picture on the slide, sometimes we're posed a problem that looks like just a mess of maybe a forest and a bunch of trees. But if we do the work and we look at it the right way, everything lines up, and we can see how we can use operations research to move the conversation forward. The third lemma is maybe not so obvious to my talk, but I will say that who does operations research matters as much as what operations research can do. When I look into the audience today and I see who's attending the conference, it's clear that our community looks a lot different than it did in 1979 when operations research was declared dead. And I think this is a big reason why operations research is clearly flourishing. Our community has broadened over the years, and I've been part of the operations research community long enough to see that every time we've broadened a little bit more, we study new problems, we look at old problems in a new way that's really transformational for the field, and just what we do is a little bit more exciting. There's more diversity of thought, the conversations become a little bit deeper. And we've come a long way, but we also have a long way to go. So I hope as a community, we can continue to create an ecosystem where everyone is welcome to the table and can do OR by bringing their full, authentic selves with them. This will make our community stronger. The operations research profession and Informs can reach new heights when we create a place where everyone has opportunities and is valued. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer some questions here.
We have an option. You can, in the room, go to a microphone. We have an option. You go to the microphone here as well. We have the virtual program. We have, whoa, there we go. Microphone here in the room for live, and then we also have, for the virtual, we have the chat open, so please feel free to use the chat. So please go ahead with your question.
Hello.
I was really happy to see that you took the policing work from the workshop. Veronica, right, was the
Yes.
student who attended the workshop with me. And I was wondering if you have some advice for the audience on how you're able to sustain the conversations with some of these organizations like EMS and police departments that are themselves so busy that it's hard to find time in the schedule for them to actually meet with us.
Oh, that's a really great question. And so that was the project that I had where it's like it's like the one that doesn't belong with the others. But what typically happens is that if I get a phone call, somebody's really desperate for some advice and they're willing to put in the work because they've made the phone call. And so those are typically the approaches that have paid off. And I've worked with a number of EMS agencies. The conversation has always gone that way, or somebody puts me in touch, like put somebody from the agency in touch with me. So they're super receptive. It has not gone as well when I approach them with the problems. And the first agency I really worked closely with, they were willing to try things out of the box, which was really exciting for me in operations research, on operations research, because we can do things that, haven't been published in the literature. The policing work I did was different, where I really knew that there was a problem there that was like so fascinating and so difficult, and I really wanted to delve into it. And just very luckily, there were some pieces, people were really receptive. So that was really helpful. I also do a lot of free work whenever I do these. It's just also like applied work is really time consuming. So I ended up, I always just offer to do data analysis. People love having you take a look at data. People don't like data as much as we do, and crunching the numbers. So people find this really valuable. But they actually had this program that I mentioned was in place, and they had monthly meetings, and we could come with, and we could look at the numbers and present them. And so that was really helpful. And there was also a medical doctor was also part of the original project, and she was understaffed and needed some people to help to make sure some of those publications could happen. So it was just the stars aligning. But you do have to make like these investment decisions because you only have 24 hours in a day. But I find that if you're really passionate about something and you're willing to do a little free data analysis, that sometimes gets things going, and then you can submit the proposals and make it work.
Sounds
That's
good.
a great
Thank you.
question.
Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead in the room.
Thanks, Laura. I was interested to ask about this idea of precheck being to target the resources towards higher risks. I think that's pretty different from how most of us have come to see it, where we paid to be in this much smaller group. But if that's the goal, then you'd ultimately want the vast majority of people in that group. So is there some way to reconcile that, or has it just gotten away from that objective?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So people do sort of self-select to be in pre-check. You do pay for it, but you get a convenience, and then there's the background check that happens to really verify the low-risk piece of that. And one of my so I'm glad you asked that, because in one of my op-eds, I noticed that because people haven't traveled for a while, their TSA pre-check memberships were expiring, and without having a lot of travel planned for the near future, you can see that people aren't going to be in TSA pre-check much longer. Without that perceived benefit. So I do think that eliminating or temporarily suspending some of those renewal costs might be good to help ensure that travelers are enrolled in TSA PreCheck. You're welcome.
Hello. So sharing with the public is, of course, very important, but it's also very tricky and very scary. Have you found ways to include your students in that process, to start that learning process early on?
That's a good question. It is tricky. My advisor forced me to do stuff with the media. I joke about it. It is really tricky and it was hard. And I did receive media training at one point to answer some of the questions. I wrote a small paper on it that I can share afterwards. It was published in SN Operations Research Forum last year with some tips for getting started that were really helpful for me, and I can share those later on. But I can give you like the long version, which is like reciting the whole paper, but I won't do that. But it is really great to do that. What I mostly do with my students is have them work with the collaborators and talk about operations research to, for example, police officers. This is a really great skill, and it builds a lot of those precursor steps to talking directly with the media.
Great, thank you.
Hi, thank you, Laura, for that really interesting presentation. I had a similar question on do you have any tips for people who are thinking about how to connect with communities and start this work that's more applied? So for example, it takes some amount of time to get to know a problem domain well. So do you strategically pick, say, a small number of places to get started? And as another example, you mentioned sort of offering to do some free data analysis. But in my work with practitioners, I have found that sometimes there's this perception that academics come in, take data, and leave. So how do you kind of address that tension?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you have to build trust. I mean, in any relationship, but especially these collaborative relationships. And early on, it's helpful to think about what you have to offer for them. Like, obviously, it's really good for you to get some data and to move things forward. I found that it's much harder these days because there are fewer face-to-face conversations and things are happening more over email, where it's more challenging to have that initial conversation. Like, it doesn't go well over email, and people are really good at deleting emails, for example. But just thinking about that, following up on things, sometimes just being the squeaky wheel. The big takeaway is to let all your colleagues know that you're interested in certain types of things, so that more opportunities funnel to you from people that are really, really willing to collaborate and give things a try. If they have a real problem and they don't know how to address it, they'll maybe extend you a little bit more grace and a little bit more time up ahead initially with some of the problems. A big benefit, though, is academics are seen as really unbiased. And I'm not totally unbiased. I think analytics and operations research are the best. But that's all I'm really trying to sell them. When they work with others from private industry, it just, things come across very different. Like, they're always trying to sell them a product or a service. And so it is really good to get your foot in the door for certain types of conversations, especially when the other people that they might talk to are not academics. And I found that those opportunities also are very good.
Thank you.
Hello, it was a wonderful presentation. So I have one question, like, based on, like, you have did different works. So, like, how do you measure that the recommendations you are giving, those are sustaining, like, in the long run? Like, often there are problems and, like, that can be solved and there are good results analytically, but in practical situations, sometimes these problems are, like, the recommendations are not being carried out properly, right? So it's also like the success of the projects also depends on the sustainability, right? So how did you measure this success on long terms?
Yeah, and so I don't want to contradict that's a great question. I don't want to contradict myself in the talk, but sometimes you really just have to do the really good academic research, and you should try all those other things, but your success, to a large part as an academic, is measured on what you can do in the discipline. And there's things you can't control that happen beyond that. So you want to, like, set up an ecosystem and maintain some relationships so that your work can have influence. But I've moved on from certain application areas because I have 24 hours in a day, just like anybody else. And I add them more strategically at different times. But your research is still out there. So even though you may have moved on, people will discover it and come back to you. And that can also lead to follow-up examples. one of my papers I wrote, I mentioned that one of my algorithms is used to route fire engines. That was something that totally came from looking at the data. We saw that all of these response times were correlated because you often have to send, by protocol, multiple fire engines to a call. And so we just were like, purely technically, this is an interesting problem. We can expand, we can address this issue that hasn't been addressed in the literature. And then I got an email within a year that it was published from a software company, like, hey, can you share some code? We want to implement it. And so sometimes you just get lucky and do good research and it gets discovered by somebody because people do need it. And I only know about it because they contacted me. So there might be other things out there, I just don't know about them yet. And I mentioned the big time lag between doing the aviation research and seeing the impact. And that was hard to think about my research and just like dying on the vine, but it didn't. It took some time for the pieces to align. So I have a long view for it. And if you do good work, eventually things will happen. But in public sector OR, sometimes implementations get a little political, and that's sort of plagued the area since the early days of OR. Thank you. You're welcome.
We have time for one more, and it actually just arrived in chat. So let me read this to you. It's from Michael. What do you see as the biggest challenges for our profession to more fully embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think about that one a lot. We can't flip a switch overnight, and a lot of the work in diversity, equity, inclusion is not really exciting. We saw the code of conduct. There were recent announcements, and the board recently approved a policy to handle complaints raised by the code of conduct. That's not like the most exciting advancement in diversity, equity, inclusion, but it's absolutely critical. For making a community where everyone really feels safe and is valued, and we can step in when it's not working that way. But having a sustained commitment to that is important. I'm president-elect, so I'm hoping I'm planning to sustain a lot of the work that's being done, but really to focus on structures and processes is really how we make that. And I think we're very systematic by nature as operations research. So I'm very optimistic, but it always is the challenge to really make sure it gets in writing and becomes policy and we stick with it. It's a lot more exciting than I made it sound too. It's because those things really live beyond.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you to our virtual audience for asking a question, and thank you for an amazing presentation.